Welcome to Feeling Beings Who Think, a podcast project that seeks to find wisdom in conversation through the stories and personal reflections of regular people like you and me. My name is Ariane Rice, and I'm really grateful you're here. So let's get started. Once, years ago, I was getting coffee from that chain place where you and I get coffee on a regular basis. You know the one. Anyway, I'd ordered my drink and I was waiting, and then waiting some more for the barista to fulfill what I thought was a simple latte request. Now, I don't remember what was happening or why it was taking so long, but I do remember getting mad. Mad in that way we sometimes do, or I should say the way I know I do when I am not getting what I want when I want it. And so, in no uncertain terms, I let her know. And I don't remember exactly what I said, but what I do remember is when I walked out the door holding my coffee, a voice in my head very clearly said, "Wow, Ariane, you never would have talked to her that way if you were wearing that priestly collar around your neck." And I wish I could tell you that I went back in and apologized, but I did not. I have, however, reflected on this many times since. Now look, I know that priests are people, but come on. Don't you expect that people who are priests are just a little bit better, just a little bit kinder, a little more patient, and frankly, just a little holier than everybody else? I know, me too. We do that with professional identities, don't we? The ones that we take on ourselves and the ones that, are put on us as ways of being in the world. I mean, our professional identity is a way we are choosing to show up. And when I have a collar on, I am pretty aware of how I want you to see me. A professor in seminary once said, "You are no more or less Christian than any other Christian. You are just living out your Christianity in a public way." Well, my guest today is the Reverend Canon Kristofer Lindh-Payne, and we kick off this conversation talking about these questions around identities. In particular, the identities our titles confer and how they can connect us, but also separate us from connecting with ourselves and with others. Kristofer seeks to bring wholeness into the world as a religious professional with a variety of identities that he shares, and also as a community organizer. He's someone who really looks for and creates connections between people and communities, no matter how different at first glance they might seem. I really delighted and chuckled in hearing how at an early age he was so drawn into sacred space and rituals. He was so eager to discover that thing that's so hard to put words around, because it is a quality of wholeness, of not feeling separate. In fact, it's when you fundamentally know, you trust that you are held, you are connected, you are loved. And we talk about how valuable it is and how grateful we are to have a moment like this in a conversation when we can reflect on and remember those times. Kristofer and I agree it's a really good thing for us to do. Just one more quote I'll share that I wrote down was when he realized that anything he was trying to do somewhere else, well, he says, "I realized I had to figure out how to do that right where I was." It is hard to stay planted sometimes, isn't it? That's another way we compartmentalize. Oh, the grass is always greener over there. If only we could get there, then we could do that. But you know the adage as well as I do. Wherever you go, there you are. All right. I hope this conversation creates some space for you to reflect on when and where and how you can feel whole right now, integrated right now with all the parts of who you are. How can you strengthen your knowledge and feeling of connection to that goodness that really is in the world, even when it is hard to see. Okay, I hope this conversation helps in encouraging that for you. Thanks so much for listening. Hi there, Kristofer Lindh-Payne.
Hi, Ariane.
Thanks for making time for this conversation with me. I appreciate it.
It's a joy and a privilege to get a chance to talk with you. I've been very excited to since you invited me.
Me too, especially because you and I have been conversation partners for a little over a decade now.
Indeed, we have. I have memories of early conversations that we had, and then hundreds of them in between. So yes.
Yes. So I will just introduce you briefly by sharing all your titles. And one of the things about all these titles is they sound somewhat intimidating, and yet you are one of the you are one of the most welcoming, least intimidating, and the most gracious of ways people that I know in this quirky little state of Maryland.
Well, now you're making me blush. Not because of the titles, but because of like the approachability, the welcome, all that stuff.
Well, that is who you are. So, okay. So Kristofer Lindh-Payne is an Episcopal priest. He is also a community organizer. He is also co-rector, which is a pretty unique term in our lives as priests in the Episcopal Church. He is co-rector of the Church of St. Francis and Community Center here in Maryland. And he is also a brother or friar with the Order of St. Francis. So those are a lot of different religious identities, aren't they?
Oh, don't forget Canon. Don't forget the Canon.
Oh, that's right. Oh my gosh. And like the most intimidating part of the title. Maybe you should explain what a canon is, because I have a feeling a lot of people listening to this, most of them actually do not know what a reverend canon for congregational development means.
I hope they're not counting on me to be able to explain that, because I feel unworthy to explain it in any full way. So, but
well, let's just take a minute here and say something about the fact that one of the things that we do in the church is we create a lot of titles and language that have no meaning outside of the church.
That's very well said. Very well said.
Why do you think we do that?
Whew. That's a good question. So one of the things that I'm asked frequently by people, like a day doesn't go by, is what should I call you? And my response is, I would love for you to call me Kristofer. And so and then for some people that's uncomfortable for a variety of reasons, really only for those inside the church, because of, I think, because of the way the Episcopal Church tends to order our common lives together, because of the hierarchy that we use to structure ourselves, because of the orders of ministry, and there's a great diversity of approaches within that, but it's also it's peculiar for sure.
It is,
and something that I think for people that are looking from the outside looking in, like they not only do they not really understand usually, but it doesn't really matter. Like, so, and the truth is that it's not that it doesn't matter to me. It's just that, as I said, my name's Kristofer. That's the name that I was given when I was born. Like, so please call me that. If you're uncomfortable with that, we can talk about that. So, but yeah.
No, that's one of the things I relate to. And as a woman, people often say, like, what should I call you? And I definitely prefer it when people just call me by my name. And I do think it's really interesting that we have these titles to designate ourselves in ways that you only know when you're in the club. When you're in the club, the titles make a lot of sense, and some of them are quite intimidating. But when you're not in the club, they just sound a little strange. Somebody, just call me the Vicar of Dibley. Like, what's the difference?
Well, and I think one of the things that's interesting, and this is a commentary, not so much on the church, but just like on some of the ways that we as human beings think about things, is that we're not particularly good at living whole lives. Like we're really good at just compartmentalization, and the roles that were assigned to us in our families of origin, like, it's like we often unconsciously live those things out. And so it's like, when I think about titles, like I think another way of describing it is like these are parts of who I am and parts of how I function in the world. They can serve to help me connect, make it more possible for me to do what I'm called to do, be what I'm called to be, but they can also be incredible barriers for that, not only for other individuals, but for systems too. It's like when we think we're having to live out this role assigned to us without really processing what that means, we can do all sorts of violence to ourselves and other people. And so I don't know if any of that makes sense. I don't know if I'm saying it in as clear a way as I could, but I'm fascinated by that. And my journey in myself, like therapeutically, after decades of really trying to really wrestle with who I am and who I'm becoming, like I longed for deeper understanding about that. And I know I'll be in that process for the rest of my life, but
Well, if somebody was watching this on the video aspect of this recording, they would see me like squirming in my seat because everything you're saying is getting me very engaged. You said a phrase talking about the parts of ourselves and how some of these titles are ways in which you seek to find wholeness through different paths and pursuits. And one of my guests, Emily Cocaine, I don't remember which episode she was in, but we spent some time talking about sort of systems theory and how we think of the different parts of ourselves. And the question I was formulating before we met this morning for you had to do with, what is it about your story that's led you to want to explore these different parts of yourself and showing up in the world in these different ways? Because they are titles and they are identities.
Mm-hmm. That is a great question. Wow, I just felt like a world open up within myself with that one. So one of the reasons why I'm an Episcopalian, like, is the understanding of the sacrament, like this outward and visible sign of an spiritual grace. So like the relationship between the outer and the inner. We have words, we have symbols, and a lot of those things it's like they're not enough to really explain fully what they point to. And so I've always had that longing. I mean, I grew up in Baltimore here, and all of the people that I was around and had relationships with, like peer relationships as a kid, were either Roman Catholic or Jewish. And I wasn't either of those things, but I was formed heavily by like those ways of being, and like their practices were foreign to me. Like I grew up nominally Protestant and United Methodist, and like but there was something about like the way that they engaged mystery and kind of their I'm trying to think of words that I could use that would be helpful in this case.
Well, what's a story? I'm curious to hear, like, what's a story?
Yeah, so I mean growing up, like I would spend the night over friends' houses. Not just, I obviously wanted to have fun with my friends, but I wanted to go to like mass and synagogue with them. So like, like I wanted to have those experiences. And like, I remember being in those environments and feeling like I was in love with the experience. And I also felt like I didn't belong. And in some ways I wasn't even welcome. Like it was, there were practices that kept me at a distance. And as a kid, it was both hard to understand that, but I also felt this gravitational pull drawing me in. Later in life, discovering the Episcopal Church as a college student, and mostly not because of any sort of worship experience, but because of these Episcopalians, these leaders, and they all happened to be priests that were doing this amazing work in the world. And I was like, what is this Episcopal Church thing? How are they doing all these things that I really love and care about? And like, what does that say about God and this particular church? And it created a curiosity in me.
What were the amazing things? What was amazing to you?
Yeah, so like there was one priest, and I went to college in this rural Southern Maryland environment, but there were like 5 Episcopal priests whose paths I crossed, which is kind of bizarre because there were lots of clergy. I don't remember meeting other clergy really in the community things that I was involved with as a student, and there were a lot of them. But like one of them had just come back from living in India among the missionaries of charity, and she had like a 2-year volunteer experience doing that. And I had really wanted to go to India, and I saw it as a student to be able to do that. I tried a couple different ways to make that happen. And in 3 different iterations over 3 years, none of those things worked out. Like, and I remember my heart breaking at each point, because I was like, I really wanted to go away and have this experience of transformation. And the felt sense that I had was that anything that I wanted to do on the other side of the world, I had to figure out how to do that right where I was.
You felt that at that age in college?
Yeah. Oh yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. And sometimes it felt like a smackdown. Like it wasn't like it's not like I welcomed it, but I remember really wrestling with that. And
were you going to church when you were in college?
So that's a really good question. So I was going lots of places to experience spiritual community. Church was one of them. So growing up, the people that had the primary religious influence in my life, aside from these friends experience, the peers in my life and mass and synagogue, my great-grandmother was a staunch United Methodist leader in the church, and I have strong memories of being a little kid and sitting on her lap in service. And I loved our pastor. Like, I loved that experience. I loved the lifesavers that she would give me. I loved that she would put $1 in my hand and I could put that in the plate. I loved that when they'd ask if there are any people that are visiting, I could raise my hand and I could stand up and introduce myself. And I just loved being held by her. And that was profound. That was a gift. And then my uncle was Jewish, is Jewish. We would have the best conversations. Like, I can't tell if it was usually me that sought to sit close to him at family gatherings, and we met often, like for meals together, or if it was him, or maybe it was both of us. But he always asked me these great questions and brought up things, and he talked about religion and politics constantly. And so the intersection of those, and he challenged me, and I often didn't understand what he was saying or necessarily agree with him, but I always felt loved. And, and that was amazing to have that experience. Perhaps the most profound was my stepmother, who was from Japan and was Buddhist. And so the influence of having her particular expression of Buddhism present in a regular way, in a powerful way, in our living room with the altar that she had set, that every morning and every night she prayed and chanted. And I was always invited. My siblings were invited to participate. We were never expected to, but that religious practice shaped who I was as a human being. And as a college student, fast forward in time, many years, like all these seeds that had been planted were coming to bear as I volunteered in a nursing home, a low-income nursing home. And then I would get to know these people that were not well cared for, that were dying alone. And I was so sad and felt so powerless to be able to do anything. And it drove me to questions of meaning, which then got me studying philosophy and religion and psychology and the course.
All right. There's so many things here.
So yeah. Sorry.
And I'm so curious about what it was as a college student that made you or pushed you towards giving your time to volunteer in that capacity.
Yeah.
But I will own my total selfish nature. When I was in college, it was all about me, myself, and I, and having my own experiences. And volunteering was certainly one of the farthest things from my mind. But before I ask that question, just the way you spoke about these different religious, spiritual memories and experiences. First of all, I think so much of what we long for when it comes to trying to find some sort of spiritual home or some place where we can feel held, that feeling of being held, I think it's such a gift that some of us get to have it at a young age. I think that's one of the things that keeps people from seeking it out in traditional spiritual forms, because they didn't know that as a child, and church or whatever their spirituality thing, it was negative or judgmental or punitive in some way. But I, like you, also had very early experiences of feeling held and loved and safe. And that is so important in connecting with that aspect of our identity. And then the other thing that it makes me think of is how often people will say, well, I want my child to choose their religious faith. I don't want to indoctrinate them in something just because it's what I grew up in. And I think that's wonderful. And then usually followed up with, well, how are you introducing them to these choices? Because we will choose our faith based on a lot of our upbringing. And if there really is no introduction or no experience, especially a good experience. I mean, I love that you said your stepmother did these practices regularly and you were invited to participate, but it wasn't mandatory.
Yeah.
I mean, that's how often does that happen with religious practices?
It's pretty infrequent. And
Right.
I mean, the gift of being, and I love the way that you reminded me of what I was saying there, that just like being held, like, I mean, that I felt God in that experience of being held by my great grandmother, right? It's like, I felt held by being in those conversations, like as a kid with my uncle, like of sitting and praying with my stepmother. It's like those were experiences of encountering the other, the divine other in other human beings. It's so frequent that like the religious realm that we hear about is that's more about exclusion and control and who's in and who's out. And so those experiences of feeling held and loved really enabled me to look for a different way of following Jesus, of like being a Christian that wasn't about demonizing what other people believe, that I could follow what I felt in my heart and then have complete respect and love for what another human being practices in their own religious life. And that those things were not mutually exclusive. In fact, they didn't threaten one another at all, but by listening to the other person, like it actually enhanced and helped me to figure out what I believed and what I didn't. And to be able to have true dialogue that invited us both in this, invites us all to go deeper into that mystery is I think the essence of the spiritual path, but we don't talk about that at least in the church. We don't talk about it enough, and in the time that we're in right now, it's like, it's so sadly lost. But I think there are definite places where people are doing that. They're discovering it. It's just those places don't get all the attention because why would they? It's like, actually having listened to some of your, like, I know you're creating space for dialogue like this. So it's like, and I know that that's out there. So anyway.
Yeah, but we don't do a good job of it. And for centuries, we haven't done a good job of it. And, we don't have those words when we're kids. We don't have the words for like, I felt held and safe, the sacramental, the outward and visible sign of the lifesaver. And I so remember the outward and visible sign of being.
That had never occurred to me. Thank you.
What a sacrament.
Whoa. The lifesaver.
Like, the lifesaver. And like, just look at and think of that word. I mean, come on.
Wow.
And then, and I still remember, Kristofer, like you, my parents giving me the $5 to put into the offering plate and feeling as a child that you're participating alongside the adults in this, whatever it is that you're doing together when you come together once a week. It's just interesting because yes, in the church, it is hard for us to talk about it because we're all so scared about our identity and the scarcity most of us are feeling these days. And also because you don't know who wants to have that conversation about the things you can't quite talk about because they're mysteries.
Yeah. So I remember as a college student, I know you inferred we wanted to go there. It was like, I would go to the bar to have these deep conversations. And we would go to these amazing places where people without their inhibitions would talk about the things that really mattered. And then I'd see them the next day and they wouldn't remember the conversation. I remember how much that really hit me. And like, I had lots of friends that wrestled with addiction, still wrestle with addiction. I've also lost some people a lot of people that I love to that. But some of the reason that I moved in the direction that I did around seeking the spiritual life was because I saw the writing on the wall of where my life could have gone. And I had some pretty powerful come to Jesus moments, like where I was like, if you keep going down this path, it's going to lead someplace that's about death and destruction. And I had the ability to see that, and the support around me to make different choices. And so like I started removing myself from those situations and I started like pursuing a spiritual life in these different communities where like I was invited to explore that. And sometimes I was incredibly invited, and sometimes I was invited on very specific terms. Like it was like, well, if you say this prayer and you believe this particular way, then you can have the gift that we have. But if you don't, then you're, we're not really interested in relationship with you. And just being in this landscape where I was getting to study religion, but then getting to experience it in these very different communities of faith, where I was just blown away by that. And I also remember the moment where I realized that if I wanted to go deeper, I had to pick a way. I couldn't just keep sampling and experiencing and exploring. Like I needed to pick a way. And it wasn't so much about picking, but like, what was the way that chose me?
Right.
And so those were powerful moments as well.
I had a friend, I haven't seen him in a long time, but he was raised Roman Catholic, and then he studied Buddhism very intensely. He really studied. He had a Rinpoche, a teacher. And after 10 years of intensive study with this Rinpoche, the Rinpoche told him, you need to go back to your roots. Everything you've learned, you need to take with you and go back to your roots. And like you, I enjoy gleaning wisdom from various traditions, and I find it's necessary to really enhance my understanding of Christianity. And I think I feel a need to go deep in one tradition. And the one place where I resonate now with you is you were talking about, you never felt threatened by these other denominational realities that never bothered, you thought it was great. I was not nearly as wise when I was around that age. Gosh, I even when I started seminary, I kind of shudder to think at how judgmental I was. And because I was so leaning into a very, I guess, specific thing that I thought was right. I'm curious to hear more about how that wasn't the case for you. Because I think a lot of us go through a period, I'll use like Richard Rohr terminology. He talks about like the first half of life, second half of life. And the second half of life being when we stop needing to so tightly hold on to our ideology. We can really say like, well, this is what I believe and this is tradition I follow. And it's not a question of right or wrong. It's a question of this is a choice and an expression. So say something about that, please.
So it came back to relationships. So like, I remember the point where it was like, okay, I felt clear that I was being called to walk this path as a Christian. And so I sought, as a college student, the communities that were doing that with what seemed to be integrity. I sought the people that I was like, oh, they seem interesting. And part of what I found was a very narrow perspective on that. And because of my desire to throw myself into that, I found a lot of tension within me. Like, it's like, if you pray this salvation prayer, like then Jesus will be in your heart. And like, I have this memory of like being asked, well, so now that you prayed that, like, experience of what felt like Jesus sort of like laughing and crying at the same time. It's like, why are you trying to do this? I've always been here. But I think where my path had to diverge from that way of being a Christian was when the expectation was that I would condemn my Buddhist stepmother and my Jewish uncle. And that because of the way that they loved me, I was like, there must be another way.
Mm-hmm.
Must be. And I don't care if I can't have that in my hands now, like there's got to be a different way. And that was some of how I stumbled into these Episcopal priests. And I know I gave the one example of Mother Teresa, but another really profound one was that happened around September 11th. And this was for this country and in many ways the world, like there was a lot that shifted in terms of how things were before and after. But and many of us, at least in the United States, have like, we can say exactly where we were. Well, I remember because the Episcopal church that was on the campus of my college, they started to ring the bells, and I suddenly found myself in that space for prayer. Mm-hmm. And then the priest there invited me to read at a service, a community service they had like maybe the next day or two. And I was like, I've never done anything like that before. And he asked me to read, believe it or not, the prayer of St. Francis of Assisi, the prayer of tribute. And so like the way that seed was planted in me to speak that in front of hundreds of people that were crammed into this little space as powerful as that was to feel held in that environment, what was even more powerful was when on that Friday, Tuesday, September 11th, was that Friday when another Episcopal priest called me, because we met through an environmental interfaith group. And he said, I'm going up to the mosque that's across the Patuxent River in another county, because their mosque had been desecrated the day before. And I want to just go there to show up and be present with them, to let them know that that's not how Christians behave. And so I got to go with him. He's like, do you want to come with me? And I said, yeah. Like, we went, and getting to worship with them. And then the relationship that formed between that mosque and that Episcopal church, being able to gather for worship, to have the bishop show up and and bless that, to hear the Muslim call to prayer within like this interweaving, like that, all of that just really changed me. It showed me that whatever frameworks I thought existed that could hold us, my imagination could not even begin to imagine what was possible. I mean, it's like, and that was, there was such depth in that. And so like in this moment of complete disintegration and fear and anxiety, like I was finding things to hold on to, other people, the sacraments, being brought in by communion. I hadn't experienced communion in the Episcopal Church at that point, but like those were the things that were like helping me to find comfort, but also to be fed, to do the work that I was being called to do, this work of justice that I already wanted to do, that I already was finding expressions for that. But the way that my religious life suddenly interwove with that, and I saw these figures that were already doing it. So it was like, how do I follow Jesus? Like, well, they were giving me some icons about how I might do that. So
yeah, that's interesting, because when I discerned my quote unquote call to the priesthood, it was also connected with, I was part of a faith community that was trying to do justice in the neighborhood it resided in. And I had never experienced that before. Like I had never had an experience of, like, I guess I knew charity was some aspect of church growing up, right? But to me, there was not an engaged relationship in terms of trying to do something because it's the way Jesus wants the world to live, in this way of equanimity and mutual love and compassion and helping to build up for the common good. And I don't even think I had the words like that back then.
You do the work, and then you find the words. Like it's like in
right.
doing the work of justice side by side, it creates those relationships that then further you down that path. And like, I love that you name the distinction between charity and justice, that in some ways is obvious, but a lot of times it's really not. The church is way better at doing charity than it is justice. And, it's a lot messier. It's when we do charity, we feel good because we're helping another person. Like, I don't fault people for that.
Right.
I know that's been early on in my life. That was something that really drove me, but I didn't stop there. Like, it was like, so then I started asking questions about like, why were people living alone in this low-income nursing home? Why were people living in the shelter where another Episcopal preacher had helped to found this homeless shelter for men? And I got to get involved with that. It's like starting asking those deeper questions and being around some thoughtful religious people that were willing to use their rational faculties to ask questions, to say like, the things in the world as it is like are not okay. And that's sort of the entry into organizing for me, is like the tension between the world as it is and the world as it should be, the world as it can be.
So like I keep picturing like this like crossroads in your early adulthood. And then there's like this path of community organizer and this path of the priesthood. So when did you decide you wanted to be ordained, and how did you decide that was going to be a part of community organizing?
So for me, I am both called to be priest and organizer. Like, I see them as two sides of the same coin. It took me a long time. Like, I was in seminary really grappling with that.
Did you go right to seminary after college?
No, I went to graduate school after seminary. I went into formation with the Jesuits at Loyola in Maryland and went through a pastoral care and counseling.
After college, you mean?
Right after college.
Okay.
I worked for the college that I went to, organizing students to do service and social justice. And then while I was in doing that work for 3 years, I started graduate studies. That invited me into deeper spiritual formation, relationships with people, with religious leaders from around the world, and from all these diverse perspectives, many of whom were in the Christian church, but not all, and that just woke me up to sort of this, I was like, well, I loved the way that they were thinking about things. Like, I just fell more and more deeply in love with the Episcopal Church, and that I could stand in that way and still be completely in relationship with people that believe differently than me. That it's like this both and that existed within Anglican theology and the ethos, the way of being. Like, I didn't know what that was, but I felt it. I saw it. And I was like, and I wanted that. Like, I wanted people that were willing to live in that gray area, that recognize that things weren't just black and white.
Yeah. That you'd said earlier about, we have the experience and then we put words around it. And I thought of one of our seminary theology books was Faith Seeking Understanding.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of us who kind of fall in love with the Episcopal Church, the Anglican tradition, especially as adults, it's because all of a sudden we start reading some beautiful text. Some of it's very academic and intellectual, and some of it is poetry and prose and hymnody that puts these words around this longing we have for creating that feeling of wholeness. And the wholeness is always the both and, because if you do the either or, then you're dividing. The wholeness is incorporating all of it.
And you realize that the thing that you feel in your core, other people feel also. And not just now, but like thousands of years ago also. You're a part of this thing that will continue forward also in some shape. And so being a part of that larger communion of saints is the language that we use in parts of the church. Like being a part of that was really important to me. Like I had experiences of God, but a lot of that was mediated through the traditions of the church. Like, a lot of it was not, but I could find resonance with the words that people used in sacred text, in hymnody, to use your examples. And I was like, wow, like that inspiration just like connected with me deeply. A lot of stuff didn't fit for me also, but like there was space enough to be able to move through that. It wasn't about like the consumeristic culture that our society puts forward of like picking and choosing, but it's like the tradition was large enough that I had lots of options and that I could find my way through, and there was room to grow in that. And I really appreciated that. I needed that. I needed that structure. That helped me to thrive. Hasn't always, but
one of the questions that I want us to look at for a minute has to do with the length of time we've now been ordained. Well, I should say, the job it's not the way I thought it would be when I first went towards this priest thing. And I'm curious because I don't know if you would use the word entrepreneurial spirit, but I feel in some ways that you are an entrepreneurial spirit in terms of thinking outside the box to try and get to yes, in whatever capacity yes needs to be gotten to. I mean, you're co-rector. And why isn't that a term that we know? Yeah. Most of us just know. I mean, I am a rector.
So much there to unpack. This is really fun. It's been a little more than 13 years since I've been ordained. And so I'm a runner. Like, that's not only integral to my physical health, but also my spiritual and emotional well-being. And I've never run a marathon, but I've run some half marathons. So like when I hit the 13.1 marker, maybe I could run a marathon, maybe not literally, but like, it's like, what is 26, 0.2 miles look like? What does 26.2 years look like? So taking that long view in this and the trajectory of my life and ministry and formation. I love the word entrepreneurial. I don't necessarily use it on a regular basis to describe myself, but if you look at the ministries that I'm a part of and have been, I would say they fit neatly into that category. I have been co-rector twice now, which is most people don't even know what it is, but I've had 2 experiences of being that. And both have enabled just room to partner in a deep way with another human being in leadership, but also to hold up the model of partnership, because I think so often we think that we have to do things by ourselves on our own. And Jesus sent people out, in pairs. So it's like, it holds that up and in a way that I think is helpful. You talked about me being the co-rector at St. Francis Episcopal Parish and Community Center. Like, our vestry was clear because we're a new community. We formed we're the merger of two Episcopal churches that came into being in the pandemic. So our identity being formed through that experience. But the vestry was clear that we are a parish. We are a part of a geographic boundary. And so they see the church as not just this building, this geographic boundary that we're a part of, and that they want to be a community center, a space where people gather, not only to be formed and to worship, but to figure out how to give, to share the gifts they've been given, in the form of the treasure they have, but also in their time and their talents, and how that's shaping the world, how it's changing the world, how God is changing the world through us. And so there's been lots of really beautiful, miraculous things that I've seen in the short time that I've been able to journey with them. It just blows my mind what God is doing. And like, it's ridiculously humbling, because it's like, I know it's so far beyond us. Like, it's like when I step back and I see, it's like, it's God that's doing this, and we get to participate in it.
So much of your story, or the way I'm seeing it, has to do with this idea of partnering. I mean, it's unique when congregations come together to form a new partnership. That really is unique. Most of the time it can't happen, because partnering, that's very hard for us to do. Because then, does one congregation lose? Does one congregation win? Do we stay? Which building do we stay in? All of these kinds of questions. And then co-rectoring, that's a partnership for you. And then this partnership of community organizer and being a priest, and the outward and visible sign of justice, and the ways in which you make that sacramental. And then the partnership of joining a community of St. Francis. You're joining in with a tradition and partnering with a practice, right? That I imagine is somewhat regimented. I mean, that structure of a religious order. So I kind of want to ask, where is partnering hard for you?
That's a great question. It's hard every day. None of this is easy. There's a reason why not everybody does it. Like, it's hard, but like, it's so life-giving also. And like, I'll give you an example. So like, I work for St. Francis Episcopal Parish and Community Center, and I work for the diocese. So like, I am co-rector and I'm canon for Congregational Vitality. So there's a partnership that exists in that. And for me, it's not just about me and what I do on a day-to-day basis, but how St. Francis partners with the diocese, this larger entity that we're a part of, to be able to have greater impact in the world around us. That one individual person can do a lot of amazing things, but two people together can do so much more. Well, a small group of people, how much more can they accomplish? And then when you think about how a congregation organizes itself in alignment with what God is calling it to do, like, what could you accomplish then? Well, if you start imagining how can two churches do that together, well, what do we need to let go of so that we could do this new thing together? It's hard to let go, for sure. Like, that's really hard and painful. I have to smack my hand all the time when I reach out to try to grab hold of something tightly. It's like, nope. Sometimes it takes someone else smacking our hand and being, but I'd say right now I feel the tension of like being a part of this, the diocese and the parish and community center, and how together we can have greater impact. That's not about preserving institutions, but it's actually about choosing death so that resurrection can happen, and that resurrection power can be unleashed in the world to be able to change our lives, not only our individual lives, but our common lives, like that help us to see God's power and God's love made manifest in that. It's hard to see that. It's hard to have eyes to see it. It's even harder to like let go of myself and my own agenda to help lead others in letting go of self and agenda. But like when we do have those moments of surrender, like to see what occurs, it's beautiful.
I know. I love the seeing image, and you're making me think of one of my favorite prayers, which we say it on Good Friday, and I think maybe at Easter Vigil, like, help us to see and to know that the things which are being cast down are being raised up, and all things are being made new. And Paul's letters of like, see, now is the acceptable time. Now is the day of creation. All things are new in Christ. And okay, I don't want to get too scripturally throwing it out there, the sacred rhetoric, but sometimes I'm just overwhelmed with the intimacy and insight of these words that have lasted centuries and centuries, and how they speak so readily to experience of now.
And now we are in this season of Advent, the beginning of a new time. It's like I love that our new year isn't in accordance with the rest of the world. It's like, so it invites us to start anew, like to recognize that God is doing something new. It's also hard and painful to do that because,
so hard. So hard. Okay. So I'm mindful of the time and incredibly grateful for what you've shared. And this went by like really fast for me. I got really engaged. And one thing I want to close with, I did my morning reading this morning, and apparently it's the feast of St. Andrew. Apparently that in the Episcopal Church, St. Andrew is known as someone we look to and as an example of personal evangelism, which I did not know this, because the 3 instances of him, I think they're all in John's Gospel, like he's personally bringing somebody to meet Jesus.
Yes.
Did you know all this? You look like you knew this.
That priest who was a part of the Interfaith Environmental Coalition that I went to the mosque with, I remember him telling me that. He was like, because he had felt a connectivity with like the introducing. It's like, introducing. It's like, I think he had a charism around that personally. So yes, but please go on.
Yeah, well, and I think to me that was really lovely to read. As I shy away from some idea of being a evangelist in terms of, like I said, indoctrinating or trying to, what's the word when you're like pushing your religion on somebody? There's a word for that. Proselytizing. Yeah. But I think, this podcast, and certainly for me, I very much was drawn to podcasts. They were these intimate conversations I was able to listen to and take in wisdom from all different types from storytelling and faith traditions and lots of different things to strengthen my needing to be held by God in some sort of spiritual way of knowing. What do you think is a helpful thing to share, trusting that somebody out there might need to hear it, around wanting to see how we are held right now? So much is hard. It's a really hard time for lots of people. How do we trust that we're being held, even if sometimes we can't feel it?
Such a good question. Like that, your question like rocks me. Like it both like rocks me in all the ways. Like it rocks me like a baby is rocked. It rocks me like it pummels me when I look at the world around me, and I know I see through very privileged eyes. Like, but there's a lot that I think is like so concerning and overwhelming, and there's lots of cause to be afraid and anxious and despair. And I think about that, and I can get pulled into that. It's pretty easy for me as a feeler to really drawn into that. And I think about how often the sacred texts like invite us to not be afraid, to feel held by God, to recognize God as our rock. It's like how many times in my life, like the transformation occurs when I allow myself to let go and to really actually become grounded, to have my feet on the ground, to hit rock bottom, like to recognize that I can't control the situation and I have to just let go and trust. It's so counterintuitive because the world that we live in does not feel trustworthy, but like this act of faith that compels us against everything in our primal, center of our primal part of our brain, the fight and the flight and the freeze, like, to resist all that and to choose like a different way of love. That's made easier when you've had an experience of feeling held. So, I would invite people to remember a moment where they felt that and go to that space and recognize they can always go to that place. I believe that's where God meets us, and that God wants us to have that space in every moment of every day and to work to co-create that space like for others. But it is scary and it is hard. And when I get anxious, I try to control, I try to like orchestrate, and, just remembering that process of just of letting go.
Well, I think it's a beautiful invitation to encourage people to remember and reflect on those times when they felt held, and know that God is there, if they want to name it God or name it love or name it whatever they want to name it,
their great grandmother with the
Yes.
lifesaver.
Yes.
It's like, and thank you, Ariane, for connecting that for me in the way that you did today. Because as many times as I've thought about that and told that story, I didn't hear it in as powerful ways as I heard it as you spoke it back to me. So like, I got something new. And I think in reaching out to another, like in listening and sharing, we hear our stories told back to us. We hear our story. And so like, it invites us to remember that we're not alone.
Yes. That's why I so selfishly enjoy doing this podcast.
It is such a gift to the world that you're doing this. And I feel such a gift and a privilege to be included in it. So thank you.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much. And I look forward to having you back and continuing this conversation, my friend.
Anytime. But I bet you can find way more interesting and fun people than
Everybody's interesting. Everybody is it's unbelievable. It's really amazing. We're fortunate people, aren't we?
Mm-hmm.
All right, my friend. Until next time.
All right. Peace. Bye-bye.